Good morning, everyone. Today we are from Group 1 for All, and today we are going to present about social problems relating to the racial inequality. Let's begin by defining what a social problem is. According to sociology, a social problem is a condition that undermines the well-being of some or all members of the society, and is usually a matter of public controversy. This means that social problems affect not just individuals but entire communities. They are both objective and subjective. Objectively, they create harm, and subjectively, people recognize and debate them as issues that need to change. Social problems also shift over time. What was considered a major issue in the past may differ from today. Common examples include poverty, crime, discrimination, and inequality. This condition sparks debates, shape policies, and often divide public opinion. Now let's apply this to the definition to racial inequality. Objectively, we see disparities in education, employment, housing, healthcare, and justice system. These inequalities directly impact the opportunities and well-being of certain racial groups. Subjectively, people recognize racial inequality as just and in need of change. This perception fuels activism, public debate, and policymaking. What's important here is that racial inequality is not just about personal prejudice. It reflects deeper societal structures and power dynamics. That's why we consider it as a major social problem, as it undermines fairness, divides communities, and limits progress. Thank you.
Next, we're going to talk about the historical background of racial inequality. This involves the unequal distribution of resources, power, and economic opportunity across races in a society. And one of the examples of racial inequality happened in the United States, where there were slavery as economic foundations and systemic discriminatory policies, unequal enforcement of protections. And this leads to certain long-term effects, such as limited access to resources and opportunities, wealth accumulation barriers, educational and healthcare disparities, and residential segregation patterns. And presently, it has the following impacts, such as wealth gaps between racial groups, educational attainment disparities, healthcare outcomes and life expectancy, and criminal justice system enforcement. Next, we're going to look at the 21st century racial inequality. Despite the civil rights legislation, racial disparities still continue across key areas, such as wealth, where there are gaps between white and black households that widen significantly, and also from the educations, we have 40% of white adults have bachelor's degree, while only 26% of black adults have bachelor's. And then the unemployment rate for black adults is 6.1%, which is much higher than for white people, which only 3.3%. And there is still discrimination in access to high opportunity neighborhoods. And finally, we have disparities in health outcomes and access to care. Now, while the explicit biases have decreased since 1960s, racial discrimination still persists. And this consists of explicit bias, where fewer people believe in excluding minorities from neighborhoods or opposing interracial marriage. There are also implicit bias, where thoughts or impulses that manifest as prejudice action or reaction without bias intent. And finally, we have pervasive impact, where it affects banking, housing, employment, and other sectors in subtle but consequential ways.
Up next, let's talk about the current issues surrounding racial inequality. The 2020 racial justice movement, which began after George Floyd's murder, was a pivotal moment. It grew into what was potentially the largest mass protest movement in American history, and was described as a national reckoning on race. This wasn't a fringe event. It extended to hundreds of heavily white counties and communities across the nation. We also saw a major shift in public opinion, with 76% of Americans considering racism as a big problem, which is a significant 26 percent point jump from 2015. And beyond the social and political impact, racial inequality has a staggering cost to the economy. Gaps in economic opportunity between racial groups and non-Hispanic white individuals cost the US economy trillions of dollars every single year. The social impacts is just as severe. It leads to the reduced well-being for targets of discrimination, limited access to high-opportunity neighborhoods, and persistent barriers to educational and economic advancement. These factors combine to create a deep intergenerational wealth and opportunity gaps that are incredibly difficult to overcome. First, the debate of reform versus abolition. Reform advocates for making incremental policy changes within our existing systems. In contrast, abolition calls for a more radical restructuring of systems that are seen as being fundamentally rooted in racial oppression. Next, we have the debate between universal and race-targeted policies. Universal policies are designed to benefit all Americans with the idea that they will particularly help marginalized communities. Race-targeted policies, on the other hand, are specifically designed to address and close known racial disparities. Finally, there's a debate over race versus class emphasis. A race-first approach centers racial justice as the primary focus. A class-first approach argues that the broad economic inequality is the root cause, and tackling it will, in turn, resolve racial disparities. Okay, so expanding on the policy debate, we see a distinction between race-specific and race-conscious approaches. Race-specific policies are those that explicitly mention race. Race-conscious policies are designed with their potential racial impact in mind without necessarily mentioning race in the text. This leads to a key consideration. Can race-neutral policies ever be effective at addressing race-specific harms? There are different perspectives on this. Journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones argues, you can't use race-neutral policies to fix race-specific harms. Her view is that the problem must be named to be solved. From a different angle, former President Barack Obama has noted the political reality, stating that universal policies are more politically achievable. This highlights the fundamental tension between creating the most direct solution and creating one that can gain enough support to be implemented. These debates show just how complex and challenging it is to forge a path forward.
So now we are going to discuss about the related problems for racial inequality. So first one is the wealth and income gap. So first, racial inequality creates a big wealth and income gaps. For example, the median wealth of a black family is only about $44,000 compared to $282,000 for a white family. Studies even show that almost half of the wage gap is caused by discrimination itself, not because of the education or the job type. This gap keeps many families stuck in poverty across generations. And the second one is the educational attainment gap. So education is deeply affected. Graduation rates for black people are around 81%, while compared to the white people is 90% for bachelor degrees. And even when schools offer advanced placement classes, blacks and Latinos students are underrepresented. They make up 38% of the school population, but only 29% of AP enrollments. This limits colleges' access and future career opportunities. Okay, so the third one is health disparities and discriminations. We see big difference in health outcomes. Over half of black adults report facing discrimination in healthcare settings, which make them less likely to trust doctors or seek preventive care. Globally, race-based discrimination accounts for almost 40% of reported cases of discrimination. This leads to worse physical and mental health for minority groups. The fourth is criminal justice inequality. The criminal justice system shows clear disparities. Black Americans are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white Americans, and on average, they receive drug sentences that are 19% longer. This fuels mistrust of legal system and keep families and communities are in cycle of disadvantage. Okay, lastly is about the political representations and trust. Finally, racial inequality also affect politics and trust in institutions. A recent Pew survey showed that 34% of people worldwide think racial discrimination is a very big problem, and 70% of countries report that discrimination is actually getting worse, not better. This makes it harder for minority groups to feel represented and push for fair policies. So overall, racial inequality doesn't just affect individuals, but it spreads into education, health, justice, and even politics, creating a cycle that is very hard to break.
So now that we've studied on the related problems regarding racial inequality, we can then move on to the sociological approaches or the why of such inequality happening. So we can study this through the lens of social conflict approach and symbolic interactionism. The social conflict approach focuses on competition over scarce resources and power. So conflict theorists emphasize power struggles and exploitation in explaining race. For example, a study done by Petrocelli et al. In 2003 applied conflict theory to policing, stating that law and the mechanisms of enforcement are used by dominant groups to minimize threats to their interests posed by those whom they label as dangerous, especially minorities. So, for the context of this study, they analyzed data on police stops, and what they found is that once stopped, drivers in areas with more black residents were searched more often than in areas with fewer black residents. And those searches often didn't produce any arrests or any evidence. This suggests that power, or those with power, like the police and the dominant racial group, use the law to control less powerful groups. Next, we can look at this through symbolic interactionism, where this examines how people create meaning through interactions or everyday social interactions. From this view, we can see racial inequality as a form of reinforcement through stereotypes, labels, and microaggressions that shape how individuals see and treat each other. A study by Bell in 2019 provides an example by showing how white teachers in a predominantly black school become consciously racialized through daily interactions. Black students and families openly recognized and labeled them as white. So what ended up happening was the teachers lost their sense of being just individuals and started seeing themselves as part of a racial group. They even felt responsible for the actions of other white people and burdened by their race, which they have never felt before. Bell's study shows that race is not just a fixed category, but depends on the social setting and on people's everyday interactions. When the teachers entered a space where whiteness was no longer their norm, the meaning of their race changed, and they became more aware of their racial identity.
Now that we use approaches that was taught in class, now let's see political approaches, especially from the three major political groups. First, liberals. Liberals are very attentive to racism and they understand the impact of racism, which is racial inequality. And they also know that racial inequality is systematic and can be solved through laws and policies. And a majority of them agrees that this is an issue that needs to be addressed immediately. However, for conservatives, they actually think racial inequality is upon the race in itself. It's not systematic. And only 23% say that racial inequality is a critical threat that needs to be resolved. And for radicals, they have an interesting standpoint. They say that racism is constant and cannot be erased, and that for the solution is that each race needs to be self-sufficient. In fact, they don't see help from other races as something good. They think that by doing that, the minorities will be dependent. So what are these political groups doing? Well, as an example, for liberals, they just passed a law in California very recently for making the state apologize formally for its history of slavery of black people. And for conservatives, also recently on July 4, 2025, the Republican majority House of Representatives voted on a tax and spending package that cuts funds of SNAP. SNAP is a help and financial aid for grocery shopping, and that SNAP is actually benefiting around 11 million black people in the past year. And finally, for radicals, they highly supported a ruling in 2023 where universities were required to give minorities a higher chance of admission. These are very extreme examples, so I suggest that you do your own research to completely understand the political stances of each group. And it's not just the political approach, but they also cause some political issues. And the biggest one is the political disempowerment, especially in voting. There are a few states that still do it to this day, and the examples is Georgia and New Hampshire. They passed a law that made voting very difficult, very lengthy, with extra process and a lot of document verification. And this highly impacted minorities, especially Black people, from their full right of voting in the United States. These are the references and resources used for this presentation, and thank you so much for listening to our presentation.